like I said, I'm going to talk about today, move on and discuss, like I said, the rise of the British Empire, which predominantly, like I said, I'll talk about the Tudor dynasty overall. I'll kind of get into, I'll talk especially about Henry VIII, who's really the most famous. And of course, I'll also talk about Queen Elizabeth I, considered one of the most famous of the different rulers, of course, of the British. So if you have any comments, questions about this lecture, please let me know during the live stream, or you can always leave me comments later, of course, on my channel as well. And yeah, as you saw in that video, the British Empire is massive. If you look at this map here that I've got, kind of blow it up here for you, but you can see the British Empire at one point was in pretty much the Americas, Africa, of course, parts of Asia, the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand. So it was a massive, massive empire that expanded all over the world. You can see all the different flags at one point that represented what was the British Empire. And some have even incorporated the Union Jack flag, of course, into a lot of these different colonies or states that were formed later, like Australia, New Zealand, Canada. Of course, heard of those. That kind of still kind of part of the Commonwealth, I guess, of Britain. And so yeah, she's a mighty empire, of course, that will expand all over the world. And what's amazing about the British state itself, of course, is the fact that the United Kingdom is a very small area. Look at that amount of square miles, 93,600 square miles. That's basically the size of UK today. England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So this small state was able to somehow, take over. I think they say 1/4 of the Earth's world at one point. If you go here, look at this. Here's kind of another map showing you all the different areas that at one point the British controlled. So we have Canada, obviously, one area is pretty large. Canada is one of the largest states, I think, after Russia, that's in the world that you have. But you can see, yeah, good chunk of Africa there you're looking at. India was like the jewel, the British Empire. Australia, pretty large area as well in that map overall. But 1922, I think they seem to think that was the peak year of the British Empire. You can see the empire had a population of 458 million people, 1/4 the world's population, actually living under, the British. I think the mileage on it is, if you want the instead of, they got 33 some thousand kilometers in that one. I think it's like something like 13 to 14,000 square miles. That's the actual size of territory that the British Empire controlled at one point, which was 1/4, like I said, of the Earth's total landmass, which is pretty amazing with that. And you can see the other states that are behind them. Mongol Empire in the 13th century was the second largest, and then Russia, the Russian Empire, third largest, 19th century. Of course, you can see 1860s about peaked, I guess, overall. So anyway, kind of showing you those kind of things with of course, the British. Now, let me study about the early, history of England, especially the British history overall. Yeah, the Tudors are kind of considered important, like in the early history of, like, especially the rise of the British Empire. So they talk about how Henry VII was kind of the one where they think that the rise of the British Empire kind of starts. He tries to start exploring and colonizing. And Henry VII was this man that was at one point exiled from England, and he came back during the War of the Roses, which was the civil war that broke out between the Plantagenet dynasty, which was a famous English dynasty in medieval times, which was kind of split into these two families that were called the Lancasters and the Yorks. Henry was a Lancaster, and he eventually was able to defeat, I think, the last York king, which was Richard III, at the Battle of Bosworth Field. I think it was August 1485. Richard III was killed, and then he took over the country afterwards. And oh, they call it War of the Roses, by the way, because supposedly the two royal families, the Lancasters, had a red rose in their coat of arms, and then the Yorks had a white rose, and so hence the name where it came from. So he would come into power and of course take over. And here's kind of a family tree of the Tudors. Of course, you see it there. And yeah, you can see all the different famous rulers that were part of it. Besides Henry Tudor or Henry VII, he also had his son, Henry VIII, who had come later. Henry VII reigned from 1485 to 1509, reigning about 24 years. Then his son reigned even further from 1509 to 1547. We'll get to Henry VIII later. He's considered one of the most famous male rulers of course, of the British. He also had three children. Edward VI, his only legitimate son, who reigned for just about 6 years. And then he had also this another daughter named Mary I, who of course known as Bloody Mary, as well as Mary Tudor. She reigned for only about five years or so. And then, of course, his most famous daughter, Elizabeth I, reigned from 1558 to 1603. Of course, she'll kind of become, one of the most famous of the Tudors eventually. So, and of course, I'll get to it later. Henry was very famous for all of his wives: Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. It's kind of like a soap opera, all the different, women that he had, so we'll primarily talk about, of course, Henry VIII, and then I'll get later and also talk about his main daughter, Elizabeth. Now, Henry VIII was primarily famous for starting the English Reformation, which began in the 1530s. That's when England broke away from the Catholic Church as part of the Reformation, which was still going on in the 16th century. And primarily it was done through acts of parliament that were passed. There were several acts, like the Act of Supremacy, I think was the most famous one that was issued, Act of Uniformity, etc. And the reason why he broke away was because if you go to, of course, Henry VIII there in the images, but you go to the six wives of Henry VIII, the one at the top left, Catherine of Aragon, was this Spanish princess who was the daughter of Ferdinand Isabel of Spain. And apparently she had only given him like one daughter that had survived, which was, we'll get to later, Mary, Queen Mary, or Mary I, Bloody Mary. And so he didn't really have any surviving sons that were legit. I think he had one son that was named, I want to say his name was Henry Fitzroy, but he was illegitimate through a mistress. And so he couldn't get the throne. And so he was concerned about whether he would be able to have a male heir on the throne. And so that's why he wanted to get that first marriage annulled. However, he wasn't able to do that. And so that's when, of course, he decided to break away and form this separate church. Of course, that would be created. And so that leads into eventually Henry forming, of course, what we call the Church of England, which, of course, will break away. It will eventually become a Protestant church over time, but at first it's this church that separates from basically the Catholic faith. And it's actually this quasi-Catholic church that they later sometimes dub Henrician Catholicism, because he kind of kept a lot of the ideas of the Catholic Church, except he became the head of it. And they passed this act through Parliament that became known as the Act of Supremacy. What it did was it made the monarch the head of the church, as supreme head, and he also became basically the head of the state. I think now it's called Supreme Governor, is of course the title now that the monarch has. And after that, what happened was he then began confiscating all the church lands. He closed all the monasteries down, closed all the convents down, and he forced all the clergy to take an oath to this new church. And you'll see later that primarily your main religious officials that are under the monarch of course, in Britain later as part of the Church of England, are these two archbishops, which are the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is the more important one, and also the Archbishop of York. And so they're basically under him. And I think the Archbishop of Canterbury, I'll get to later, Thomas Cranmer, is the one that annuls his first marriage, and he's able to remarry again and again. Of course, we'll see, of course, later. So that's the beginning of this new church that kind of forms in the country. Now, like I said, he remarries. He basically, pretty much divorces his first wife. And you can, of course, see there, all the different wives. There's that famous rhyme that they sometimes joke about with the wives of Henry VIII, which is divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Of course, to kind of get an idea of what happened to all 6 of the different wives of Henry VIII. Anne Boleyn, who you see in the middle at the top, he would eventually marry her. I think it was in 1533. And she would eventually give Henry later a daughter, which will be, Elizabeth I, later queen. However, after about 3 years, she fell out of favor with Henry VIII, and of course he had her eventually removed from power and executed. Pretty much had her executed in 1536. And then on the far right, he would later marry Jane Seymour, third wife, who would later give him one son, of course, which was Edward VI. Jane Seymour, out of the different wives of Henry VIII, was really the most favorite wife of Henry, but she would die from childbirth complications. She, I think, bled to death or had some kind of issues afterwards and didn't make it. So she would die in 1537. And so basically, I think between like 1533 to 1537, he went through like 3 different wives. In the first, I think Catherine of Aragon, he put her away somewhere. I think at first in a convent or something like that. None of the other 2 died. Anne Boleyn was executed, and of course, Jane Seymour died of natural cause from childbirth. Yeah, they had some other wives you see there. Anne of Cleves was this German princess, 4th wife he married. That was kind of a political alliance he tried to make with Germany. It's one of those German states over there. And however, when she came over to England, he didn't really like her. I think he just wasn't attracted to her. And so the marriage didn't last. I think maybe I want to say 5 or 6 months. And they never consummated the marriage. And so he divorced her pretty quick. Catherine of Aragon, Catherine Howard, excuse me, was this teenager he married in 1540. And apparently the marriage didn't go well. She was having an affair with one of her cousins, who was Thomas Culpeper, who happened to be, by the way, a close friend of Henry VIII in his court. And that was found out, and she was later executed too. I think she was removed in 1542, and then I think it's 1543 when she was executed, but she was the other one that Henry also had beheaded too. So Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were both beheaded, executed, of course. And then the last one was Catherine Parr, was a divorcee who basically, I think, had been married 2 times before. And so I guess a perfect match there. But none of them really, the last 3 did not have any children with Henry VIII. She supposedly, I think, survived, after Henry died in 1547. In fact, the only 2 I think that survived, I want to say, after Henry died was Anne of Cleves, who lived a few years later too, and Catherine Parr. So, yeah, like I said, it's quite a soap opera, the whole 6 wives of Henry VIII going on. And in a certain way, Henry was like one of these kings that kind of married for love, well, in a certain way, instead of maybe political reasons. But I think at least 2 were political, I know, when he married. So anyway, I'm going to move on also to talk about, of course, some of the other rulers that come in. Henry, of course, would die in 1547. And he has this son that comes in, of course, you see up there at the top, which is Edward VI. Edward VI would reign as really one of the first Protestant rulers of England between 1547 and 1553. And, he might have been a great monarch, Edward, if he would have lived a long time. I think he came to power when he was 9. I think he was like close to 16 when he died. And the reason why he died so young was he had tuberculosis, like consumption, I think was they used to call it in the old days. And so, but they do think that under his reign, the reason why Edward is kind of important is because during his time, they began to make a lot of changes to the Anglican Church. The church went from being more Catholic to being Protestant, and they were heavily influenced by Calvinism. And so they began to adopt new kinds of prayer books, like the Book of Common Prayer was brought in as the main prayer book, which they think was edited and developed by Thomas Cranmer, who I told you about, was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And then you also start seeing even English Bibles. I think under Henry VIII, there was like the so-called Great Bible of 1539. They had the Tyndale Bible too, I think, before that as well. So you start getting English Bibles, masses being done in English, things like that. And so all these changes that start coming, of course, in the country. However, what happened though, when Edward died in 1553, he tried to put this cousin on the throne named Lady Jane Grey, who was Protestant, and she actually seized power for about 9 days. And so she was later dubbed the so-called 9 Days Queen, but she never really reigned, officially, because she was never coronated. And so Edward's half sister, which you see on the left, Mary, eventually seized control of the government and later had Lady Jane Grey executed, which I think was in the next year, 1554. So that's what you have next happen, of course, which is Queen Mary I comes in. She'll reign for around 5 years or so, from 1553 to 1558. She was not a popular ruler. In fact, I think today, and I want to say in Britain and England, she's still unpopular. They, of course, later called her Bloody Mary, not because of that alcoholic drink you may have heard of that she probably drank before. Maybe some of you may have drank it before or something like that if you're old enough. I guess you're 21 and older. I guess you may have tried it. But she later would start this whole thing called the Marian persecutions. And she started this counter-reformation where she tried to stop all the things that were kind of going on in England, like what Thomas Cranmer had done with the Book of Common Prayer. And so a lot of people like Cranmer were arrested, thrown in prison. And I think she later had Cranmer burned the stake, which is true about this. Horrible, I think in 1556 under her reign. And so that's where she got her name from. She was called Bloody Mary because she persecuted all these Protestants like Cranmer and had them executed throughout the country. And so, yeah, that's something that's well known under her reign. So had that happen. And then the other thing that happened too, had this rebellion that broke out that was called, I think it was called Sir Wyatt's Rebellion that happened in 1554. And what happened was she decided to marry the Crown Prince of Spain, who was Philip, later called Philip II, who we'll talk about, who happened to be the son of Emperor Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and also the King of Spain. And so this created a big rebellion in the country. And this man named Sir Thomas Wyatt tried to march on London to try to get her removed and maybe put someone else in power. I think he wanted to put in power, I want to say Elizabeth, the half sister of Mary. But what happened was Mary was able to eventually put it down, the rebellion. And I think they later had Wyatt executed for it. But I think Elizabeth was kind of, she was kind of suspicious of her half sister. At one point, she even imprisoned Elizabeth in the Tower of London and all that. But they're not sure if she was somehow involved in it or not. So it's kind of a debate about that. But obviously she was unpopular in the country, Mary. There is a story right before she died that she was pregnant. I don't know if you know about this. It was called the phantom pregnancy of Mary the First, and everybody thought she was pregnant. I think throughout Europe there was impending birth and stuff like that going on, but it turns out it was cancer. Basically, is what it was, uterine cancer, and she would end up dying in 1558. And so a lot of the Protestants were like, "Oh, it's a miracle that she died," that kind of thing. Of course, with that. So in the end, you get, of course, Mary's half sister, comes in, which is Queen Elizabeth the First, known simply as the Virgin Queen, who reigns from 1558 to 1603. Of course, the years of her reign have nicknames. It's often called the Elizabethan era or age. It's also referred to sometimes as being called the Golden Age of England. It's also considered the beginning of the so-called Shakespearean era, because Shakespeare kind of starts writing a lot of his plays at the end of her reign and at the beginning of King James's reign afterwards. And it's considered a very important period in British history. They think this is when really the British Empire really starts rising, because they even try to start colonizing and all that. And she did have different nicknames. I think other people called her Good Queen Bess, I think was another name. Although sometimes she could be also Bad Queen Bess, because she did put some people to death, especially Catholics that were against the regime. Also, Gloriana, I think, was another nickname that she was sometimes called as well. She is considered one of the greatest monarchs, of course, in British history. Definitely the best of the Tudor monarchs. Fourth longest reigning. You can see reigning quite a lot, over 40-something years. So she was in power a long time, but obviously the longest reigning now is Queen Elizabeth II, which we'll get to, of course, later. Now, the one thing about her reign, which is important, she starts this thing called the Elizabethan religious settlement, which began from 1558 and probably went up to the early 1560s, really. And it was a bunch of reforms where Parliament restored the Anglican Church, and they created this church, which was kind of a quasi-church between the Catholic faith and, I think, Protestantism. That was kind of the idea, to kind of bring in people that were Catholic, not just those that were Protestant overall. So they definitely think it was heavily influenced by Calvinism, because it's more of a Calvinistic type church, Reformed church, pretty much. But it had a lot of Catholic influence in it. Like they kept a lot of the traditions of the churches, like the Catholic priests and their robes and things like that were kind of kept, and religious icons were kept too, in the church. So they kept the clergy. They had the bishops and the priests and all that kind of thing, what they call episcopacy, as you know. They kept. Now they allowed the priests to marry. That's something that was, of course, different from, say, the Catholic faith, where priests cannot marry and things like that. But obviously, sermons were going to be in English. The Bible would be in English, traditional language that people could read. And then the Book of Common Prayer was brought back also as well. So those are all things that really were reforms that they made to the Church of England. And the Anglican Church ends up being one of the largest Christian communions in the world. I think it's got 85 million people are in it, third largest behind the Catholic and Orthodox faiths. And but they have these different acts that were passed under that were kind of important. They had the Act of Uniformity that came out in 1559. What that did was it reestablished the Book of Common Prayer. So that would be the standard prayer book of the Church of England up to the present now. The Act of Uniformity was also a method to force the English to go to that church. So there weren't other churches that you could attend. It's like a state church. If you didn't go to church, you could be fined or even imprisoned, things like that. You had to tithe that church also as well. And she also, so-called Act of Supremacy, which came out in 1559, that established her also as being the head of the church, head of the state as well. with the new title they changed, which was Supreme Governor, which the previous one had been Supreme Head, and that's the current title that Elizabeth II reigns under. So these were all changes that were made, of course, under Elizabeth. They were kind of important. That kind of helps to end the whole Reformation in England, but you still got other countries wanting to obviously convert it back to the Catholic faith. So yeah, those are all the things of it. You can see there, obviously, an idea to combine Catholicism and Protestantism, kind of a quasi church like that. Try to get the Catholics, kind of to come in and join the church as well. Canterbury Cathedral, that's the main seat where the Archbishop of Canterbury, of course, is. So it's kind of an important church, in Britain today. You're looking at right there. They also got the Westminster Abbey. You may have heard about that. Collegiate Church of St. Peter in Westminster, London. That's an important church because that's where all the monarchs in Britain are crowned. That's probably where Prince Charles will be crowned. I'm thinking, if Queen Elizabeth II ever dies, she's on the throne forever. But the next monarch, whoever that is, will be crowned right there, of course, you're looking at. Now, I want to talk about also, she has this cousin, of course, that's very famous. You may have heard about, named Mary, Queen of Scots, as he's what they call her, or also Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, either one. She's important because she was the closest heir to the British throne, living in Scotland. She was actually the ruler of Scotland for about 20 years, 1547 to 1567. So first cousin, you can see. So a major rival. Elizabeth was kind of fearful of her because Mary, Queen of Scots, was Catholic, and she's Protestant. And so there was a big, rivalry between the two. I think there was even a deal where she would sometimes, Elizabeth asked her ministers, who was the prettiest? Was it Mary or me? I guess they would lie and say it was Elizabeth. I think when Mary was supposed to be very beautiful, they say. But she was very controversial. If you know about Mary Stuart, she was married multiple times, at least 3 times. She had 3 husbands at one point. I think she had maybe a few lovers too, they think, as well. Her first husband was Francis II, who was actually the King of France, but he died young. And so she had been living in France for years. So she came back to Scotland and married this cousin of hers named Lord Darnley, who was known as Henry Stuart. Both were Stuarts, basically. And she didn't really like him. In fact, part of it was because of the fact that I guess her cousin, and then he was also a drunk. He was drunk all the time and didn't really care for him. And she had this private secretary named David Rizzio, who she had a lover with. And evidently Lord Darnley got mad about this and had her lover killed, like stabbed him a bunch of times, had him killed. And then she had this other man, the Earl of Bothwell, named James Hepburn, who kind of felt sorry for her, and he kind of fell in love with her. And they say that he conspired maybe to kill Lord Darnley to marry Queen of Scots. And so I don't know if that's true or not about whether they conspired together. But Lord Darnley was killed by the Earl of Bothwell, and the two married, and then that became a big scandal afterwards. So what happened later, she got arrested, thrown in prison because of the complication of what happened to her husband being killed. And so later she fled the country and she went to England. However, what happened later was that Elizabeth, who feared that, Mary might take the throne, had her in prison, is what occurred. Kind of a sad story about that. The two never met. Like Mary and Elizabeth, they never met each other. You wonder about that. And she was later implicated. So she was implicated in this death, and that's pretty much what led to her downfall, in Scotland, involved that. The other reason why Mary became unpopular in Scotland was also because of the rise of the Scottish Reformation. John Knox, who had started that, we kind of talked about that before. And so that was another reason why she left too, was because, they didn't really want a Catholic ruler on the throne. And so she was forced out at that point. So like I'm saying, Elizabeth held her in different castles, I think, throughout England. for about 20 years, etc. And it was kind of a debate about what to do with Mary. You know, that was kind of a problem because obviously if Elizabeth dies, she doesn't have an heir, she would get the throne next. But the problem with Mary was that she was Catholic, and so Elizabeth didn't really want to help get her throne back and all that. And what helped her out was that there was this plot that occurred in 1586 called the Babington Plot, where this man named Anthony Babington, who was an English lord, tried to conspire to kill Elizabeth. I think he conspired with Mary. And it was found out eventually by Elizabeth's Secret Service. Elizabeth had a spy network she had throughout England, etc. And so she was eventually accused of being involved with it and put on trial and then later executed in February of 1587. And so obviously what ends up happening is that Elizabeth kills her own cousin pretty much with that. So yeah, that's the only thing about that. You'll see later that Mary's death, ends up giving the throne to King James, who's the ruler of Scotland. By the way, became, I think, the king of Scotland when he was like 1 year old, believe it or not, because that's when Mary had fled to England. He'll later become the king of England, the first, monarch that's actually what we call the king of Great Britain, or the king of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, in 1603. And so I guess indirectly, she'll get the throne, but through her son, basically. Elizabeth, by the way, I'll kind of go back here and talk about her a little bit more. She never married. Of course, if you know about her, she was known as the Virgin Queen. This is because of the fact that for actually two reasons. One, of course, she never had a consort husband, that reigned with her. Also, they think she may have been a virgin. There's kind of a debate about that, whether she ever lost her virginity or not. I know in like a lot of Hollywood movies, they think she had lovers, but that was never really proved about her. But the two closest men that really were suitors that she could have married was Philip II of Spain, who was basically her ex-brother-in-law, the one that had been married to Mary. And then Sir Robert Dudley, the first Earl of Leicester, who was an English nobleman who she really liked and wanted to marry. But the only problem with him was that he was married to someone else. That was the only bad thing. And I think there was a case where I think Robert Dudley's wife suddenly died after she fell down a flight of stairs. And so they thought they might be able to get married, but that never happened. So she never married. Kind of a sad story about that. And so that ends up being a bad thing because it's going to end up ending the Tudor dynasty. The Stuarts will eventually get it later through James, her second cousin, who I'll talk about later. So kind of talking about that, what happened under Elizabeth. Now, I did want to talk about and move on to the other thing that happened under, of course, Elizabeth, which was the so-called Anglo-Spanish conflicts that broke out near the end of her reign, which start in the 1580s. Up to about maybe 1604, and the English and the Spanish were fighting for control of the Atlantic Ocean and parts of Western Europe. And so you get this period where, under that time, what happens is Elizabeth starts to send out these privateers to attack English shipping, which they're called sea dogs, if you know about this. And the sea dogs were these knighted pirates, basically, of Elizabeth they're called privateers, but they're basically these almost like paid pirates to go out and attack enemy shipping, and they have letters of marque from the state to do this and even take profit in it, and so they were kind of instrumental in attacking a lot of the Spanish, especially the treasure galleons that were coming up from the New World. And those are kind of a list of them you see there. Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir John Hawkins, Sir Humphrey Gilbert. Those were considered famous sea dogs that were well known, of course, that were involved with really that period and attack and defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. So yeah, you get Sir John Hawkins, the top left, who was probably one of their top commanders of the English Navy, which Henry VIII founded in 1546. Sir Walter Raleigh was very famous. He was known for exploring the east coast of where the United States and Virginia will be. He was also involved in explorations into South America. I think Raleigh was one that I told you that was searching for like the so-called El Dorado in the Amazon. Sir Francis Drake, definitely the most famous of the different sea dogs, of course. And then Sir Humphrey Gilbert was a half brother of Sir Walter Raleigh. Now, he was known for exploring the east coast of like Canada, also where the United States were overall. But Drake, you see here, was really the most famous. In fact, he had such a notoriety with the Spanish that they called him the Dragon, or the English Dragon. El Draque, I think was they sometimes called him, because he would seize their ships and burn them, is what he would do. And Drake was very famous for his circumnavigation of the world, which took place between 1577 to 1580. He had his flagship that was called the HMS Golden Hind, I think one of the very few ships that survived the expedition originally. And it's considered one of the greatest feats of the English at the time. Kind of explore the world, and I guess the English were trying to find out what aspects of the world existed on the other side of the world. And so he was important in exploring like the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean on the other side of the world. You can see there's of course a replica of the Golden Hind, which there's been several of these that have been built, but it's a type of English galleon ship, of course, that sailed around the world, which took around 3 years to do. Drake, by the way, is one of the first to successfully go around the world and survive. Because remember, Magellan got killed halfway around the world to the Philippines. Yeah, here's kind of by the way, a map showing the circumnavigation. They do think this was planned, by the way. And they sometimes do call it the so-called raiding expedition of Sir Francis Drake also as well. He was also the first to sail on the bottom of South America, and he found what they call the Cape Horn, which is the bottom of South America, all that. But you can see he sailed up like close to California and all that at one point. Now, of course, one of the most famous things that happened at the end of Elizabeth's reign was the attack and defeat of the Spanish Armada, which that occurred between July to August of 1588. Philip II, who was now ruler of Spain after his father Charles V had abdicated his throne. And so he attempted this English invasion at this point because Philip had this idea to reconvert England back to being Catholic. Philip was a staunch supporter, of the Counter-Reformation in Europe. And so he amassed this huge fleet that they called the Invincible Armada, is what they called. I think they also called the Grand or Great Armada was the other name it was dubbed. It included about 130 ships involved, and had also an invasion force too that was also going to invade and try to conquer England at this point. And I think the guy that was behind it, the one that was the commander of it, if I can show you kind of here, right there on the right, there is Alonso Perez, the Duke of Medina Sidonia. He was the actual commander of the fleet, but he ends up not doing very well, as we'll see. Here's a map showing you the route of the Spanish Armada. They were actually going to land on the southern coast of England and then try to march on London and try to take it. However, the English Navy, which was more maneuverable than the Spanish fleet, was able to decisively defeat them. But they seem to think that weather kind of played kind of a role in why the English Navy was able to win. They had multiple battles. I think the most famous battle took place in August, which was the Battle of Gravelines, August 8th, I believe is the traditional date of when it was. Part of why the English were able to win was because they were able to get their fleet above wind from them. They talk about the weather gauge, I think, during the battles of the English fleet against the Spanish. and the wind was just blowing in the right direction, so they were able to lob their cannonballs easily, at the Spanish fleet and do damage at them. And I think the English even used fire ships, which were unmanned ships, where they set them on fire and sent them to their fleet. But they think bad weather was, I think, in the end, the thing that would break up the actual Spanish fleet, and they were forced into the North Sea, is what eventually happened. And you can see here, if you look at this map here, it's kind of I think I've got an older map where it is right here. I think it's right there, but you can see how the Spanish are going to have to get back to Spain. They're going to have to go sail around Scotland and Ireland, basically, and they end up losing like close to half their fleet to try to get back. So the defeat of the Spanish Armada is pretty important. They think it was a turning point in European history, because after that, Spain starts to decline. Afterwards, they're still a major power, but England becomes this major power afterwards that'll even start colonizing parts of the world. And so, yeah, the 1588 is considered a turning point in British history, especially with the rise of the British Empire, in general. If you study about, that conflict, at that point, Elizabeth, that is really the peak of her reign, 1588. It is epitomized by a speech she gave in August of 1588. They often call it the so-called speech to the troops at Tilbury, which I think the traditional date is now August the 19th of when it took place overall. And she made that famous quote you see there, which is, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and of a king of England." And so she was kind of gave that speech kind of as a way to boost the people's morale, because I think people were thinking that they were going to get invaded at that point, conquered by the Spanish or whatever. And so it was considered one of the greatest speeches ever given, probably by a female monarch, in British history. Now, the only problem with her, she would eventually die, in 1603. Of course, everybody kind of knew who the monarch would be. Afterwards, you'll see, of course, her King James is going to eventually, her second cousin's going to come in and take over the country, who is the ruler of Scotland. He'd be the King of England afterwards as well. They're not sure how she died. There's been a lot of speculation about her death. I think there's been some theories she may have died of cancer. Has been one thing, which they think she may have gotten cancer from the makeup that she would put on her face, which had a lot of lead in it and things like that. That's been one theory. Stroke or heart attack, it could have been also as well. But she was just pretty old. She was almost 70 years old when she died. And so, yeah, the King James, of course, will come in. He'll be, of course, the next ruler, really the first ruler we call the United Kingdom of Great Britain, reigning over England, Scotland, Wales, also Ireland as well. And so the Stuarts will come in, and they're going to eventually, of course, seize power. So that's really the next thing that's going to happen pretty much overall. Now, I am going to talk for a few minutes about William Shakespeare. Shakespeare is also a very important figure, of course, in British history. He is known for his, of course, famous plays and sonnets. Of course, I do have a little short video. I'll kind of show about him a little bit on, of course, the life, of course, of William Shakespeare.
William Shakespeare, one of the greatest authors of all time, was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, England. His actual birth date is uncertain, but most scholars believe he was born on or near April 23, 1564.
We think he may have been educated in the King's School at Stratford, because that would have been typical for a child with a father who was an alderman. What we do know is that he didn't go to university.
We have a marriage record for Shakespeare to Anne Hathaway in 1585. We also have baptism records for a daughter and a set of twins. And we also know that his son, Hamnet, one of the twins, died.
Shakespeare moved to London in the late 1580s. By the early 1590s, we know he's writing, and we know that he's acting.
By 1597, Shakespeare had authored 15 of the 37 plays attributed to him, including Romeo and Juliet, Comedy of Errors, and The Merry Wives of Windsor.
People think of William Shakespeare as an artist, a playwright. He was a pretty good businessman.
In 1599, he built the largest open-air amphitheater in London, the Globe Theatre.
He was an entrepreneur, he knew his market, he knew how to cater to that market, he made shrewd real estate investments.
Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, changed its name to the King's Men when King James became its patron in 1603. This was a mark of exceptional prestige.
The different types of Shakespeare plays, they're separated into histories, comedies, tragedies, and then later on tragicomedies.
Shakespeare's phrases, the ways he used words, are so common that people often get mixed up and can't remember if they came from the Bible or from Shakespeare. My grandmother used to say, when something bad happened, that these were the slings and arrows of everyday life. She was not an educated woman, and she didn't go to Shakespeare plays. She didn't get that one from the Bible.
What scholars call Shakespeare's middle period, from 1595 to 1605, included such classic comedies as Midsummer Night's Dream, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, and Much Ado About Nothing. He also produced Hamlet, Othello, and Macbeth during this period.
Right at the cusp where Shakespeare begins to write Lear, it tips into what we could call the later Shakespeare. And this period produces Lear, Antony and Cleopatra, Tempest, Winter's Tale, Pericles, Cymbeline.
Shakespeare wrote great stories. For example, one of the stories starts with a king who is tired, he doesn't want to govern anymore, so he says to his three daughters, I'm going to separate the kingdom between the three of you, but it's going to be based on who tells me how much they love me. However much you love me, that's how much of the kingdom you're going to get. Now that's going to make me sit up. I mean, what a way to start a story. And that's King Lear.
Shakespeare was not only a playwright, he also was a poet, partly because of economic necessity. During the early 1590s, plague closed the theaters in London, and there was quite a vogue for producing sonnets.
Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets, in addition to several narrative poems.
Shakespeare worked the English language, milked it for all it was worth, made up words if it didn't give him the right words. He is one of the first professional writers.
The details of William Shakespeare's death remain a mystery, but scholars believe he died on his birthday, April 23, 1616. In the 400 years since, Shakespeare's influence has only grown. His writing is the second most quoted after the Bible. He has been credited with introducing almost 3,000 words to the English language, and a Google search on Shakespeare returns more than 140 million results.
Shakespeare talked about the human condition. He explains to us how we think, how we feel, the human psyche. He eloquently explains it.
In the 18th century, questions arose about the authorship of Shakespeare's work, given the vague details we know of his life, his lack of higher education, and the similarity of his plays to others of the day. Today, most scholars believe Shakespeare wrote all his plays and sonnets.
I would argue that Shakespeare's legacy is the most influential figure in human civilization.
Mark Twain is now thought of as America's first celebrity because he was so good at capturing the public imagination, and it became important to him to have a public image.
Well, a short little video there, of course, on Shakespeare. Sorry about that end of there, but anyway, Shakespeare, was famous for all these plays that he wrote. You can see there. Yeah, he was called the Bard of Avon. That was his nickname because he was born in Stratford upon Avon in England, right there. So you can see he wrote up to like 38 plays, 154 sonnets as well. So Romeo and Juliet, Merchant of Venice, Julius Caesar, Midsummer's Night's Dream, Henry IV, Henry V. Things out Henry VIII also as well. Much Ado About Nothing, Twelfth Night, Hamlet, etc. Othello. Those are all different plays, of course, that he was, of course, known by. Yeah, he was famous for the Globe Theater, which there are actually two Globe Theaters. He had one between 1599 to 1613. The first one burned down 1613. So they had another one they built in 1614, but it was closed by the Puritans in 1642, never reopened. I think since then they've built a new one, of course. I think in the 1990s it's kind of a replica. They think now they call it Shakespeare's Globe or something like that. I know in modern London. But yeah, he was very, very famous, of course. Probably considered one of the greatest, writers in history in any language. Now I'm going to, of course, move on today. I'm going to talk about, of course, the Stuart dynasty. I'll get into, talk primarily about the first two today. I'll kind of talk about, of course, King James the First, who really is the most famous of the Stuarts. Then I'll talk about his son, Charles the First, who, of course, starts, the English Civil War. Now, so yeah, those are all the rulers: King James the First, Charles the First, Charles the Second. You got James the Second, William the Third, Mary the Second, and then Queen Anne. So those are all the different monarchs, of course, that make it up. And here's kind of a family tree of the House of Stuart. So they're all descended back to, of course, Scotland and the Stuart dynasty there. James, of course, at the top there, of course, and of course his son is Charles the First. I'll get to Charles the Second, but he will reign after the English civil wars that break out in the country. James the Second is actually the brother, Charles the Second. It's hard to tell there with that. And then you've also got Mary the Second, who will reign with William the Third. That's her cousin, who was a daughter of James the Second. Then Queen Anne, of course, the younger sister of Mary the Second, as well. Now, James, of course, who comes in, like I said, was the first actual ruler of what we call the United Kingdom of Great Britain, where the Stuarts take power in 1603 after Elizabeth died. He, by the way, had been reigning in Scotland since the age of 1. So, he reigns, I think, 1567 to 1525, 57 years. He was the ruler of Scotland. He reigned a long time too, in Europe as an actual monarch. But at one point he reigned over Scotland first, then England, Ireland also as well. He'll die later in 1625, but you can see he's actually the ruler of England and Ireland from 1603 to 1625. He did have a wife. His wife and consort was from Denmark, Anne of Denmark. She was called. She had 2 children with him, which is Charles the First, who's later king of Great Britain, who I'll tell you later was the one who started the English Civil War. And then Elizabeth the Stuart was also later the Queen of Bohemia. So she's kind of important as well, but more in Europe. Now, there's a lot of famous events that happened under King James. James, by the way, clashed a lot with Parliament. A lot of it had to do with financial issues that he had with the Parliament. Parliament got in a lot of conflict with him because he and so that was kind of an issue that he had with him. And at one point, he even dismissed Parliament, which his son will kind of do the same thing. And the one thing about the Stuarts, which were kind of a problem, was that they believed heavily in divine right theory, divine right of kings. And so a lot of these kings like James and Charles thought they ought to be an absolute monarch and not be like a limited type monarch like Parliament really wanted. There's several events that happened under him that were famous. They had one you may have heard of called the Gunpowder Plot that happened in November of 1605. And this is where a bunch of Catholic conspirators tried to assassinate King James and put in maybe a Protestant ruler or a ruler that was more benevolent towards Catholics. Actually, they wanted to put a Catholic ruler in that was more benevolent. And The plot was found out by, they think, some of the spies that were under Elizabeth. There was a man named Robert Cecil, you may have heard of, and he was able to uncover the plot on November 5th when a bunch of men were arrested. And one of the most famous was Robert Catesby, who was eventually killed. And then the most famous was Guy Fawkes, who, of course, the Gunpowder Plot that day is often named after, which is called Guy Fawkes Day. Guy Fawkes was this Catholic who was a soldier that had been hired to bring in gunpowder barrels to blow up Parliament, because when James was going to come to the House of Lords to give a speech, they were going to assassinate him. But he was captured, and they were able to prevent, basically, the king from being murdered. And so the Gunpowder Plot later became this annual anniversary of celebration throughout the UK that they often call either Guy Fawkes Day or Bonfire Night, which is still celebrated, in modern times. So I think they made a movie about it years ago called V for Vendetta. You may have seen it before, something like that. That kind of made it more famous, I know, today. But November 5th, they had a little thing that says, remember the 5th of November, the Gunpowder Plot, treason and plot, and all that. Also, the other things that he was also known for, too, King James, he was known for colonization as well, which kind of begins, the British Empire at the time. And he colonizes different parts of the world. He'll colonize part of, North America, where Virginia is, with the founding of Jamestown in 1607. Jamestown is this American colony that was set up through a British charter through the so-called Virginia Company in 1606. And the idea was to try to settle America and try to hopefully find gold, like the Spanish were doing in the New World. And so it was like one of their first instances where they tried to colonize, part of the world. Elizabeth had tried that before under her reign, but they had failed miserably, I know, in Virginia, Newfoundland. So that was one thing they did. Jamestown will later be part of the first colony of Virginia, the so-called British 13 colonies. Jamestown will actually be more successful because of agriculture, because of the discovery of tobacco, which will be later. Of course, the other thing he was famous for, he founded Northern Ireland, which you go here. Of course, you have a bunch of Scots and Northern Englishmen that will go to Ulster, in the northern part of what is Ireland, and will begin this colonization of it, which was later actually called the Plantation of Ulster. It was an idea to create like farming or agriculture there and try to colonize it. And so you get all these people that move there, especially like Scots that come over, which they often call them like Scotch Irish, the ones that came out of Scotland that settled there. And this later became controversial, if you know about it, because the English go over there, they try to convert the Irish, to the Protestant faith, make them adopt the English language, things like that. And it later creates conflicts between the English and Scottish, the English and the Irish, which really caused like the Irish, civil war over there, as you have where you got the IRA, that forms later, Irish Republican Army and things like that. And that'll be some kind of conflict that'll happen more into the 20th century. But that's something that the British still hold today, Northern Ireland. But Ireland later breaks away and becomes the Republic of Ireland. They'll have their own separate state there overall. But yeah, Bermuda, I think, was the other one that he also colonized, which was in 1609. So early 1600s, that's about when, the British start trying to colonize throughout the world. And they'll even get into like Canada as well in the 17th century. James later became ill near the end of his reign. He had this famous English lord named the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, that ran his actual court the last few years. It was actually the regent of James's son Charles I. And there was rumors that the two were lovers, because I think there's a theory that James I was bisexual. He liked men and women, and so I think the joke in England was that Elizabeth was king and now James is queen, is what they used to say about it, and people kind of knew about that, about him being bisexual and all that. So anyway, yeah, and of course the other thing they talk about too that's famous about James. James was also known for developing the King James Bible, or King James Version of the Bible, which came out in 1611. And this was a Bible which was based off of the old Greek, texts of the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And the Anglican Church developed it. It included 39 books of the Old Testament were in it, and it had 27 books of the New Testament that were in it as well. It had also apocrypha books as well were included, which were books that were rejected by the church. I guess Christian churches or whatever were included. And it later became one of the most widely known Bibles in the world. They had been previous English Bibles they had going back to Henry VIII's reign. This is the one that they would replace and use. And it's one of the most widely known English Bibles, of course, in the world. But it is known for its use of Old English like thee, thou, thy, that kind of thing, which was kind of popular at the time. Now, I'm going to move on for a few minutes today. I want to kind of begin it today, but we're going to talk about the other thing, of course, that occurs, which is the English Civil War, which will break out under the reign of King Charles I. He'll come in 1625 after his father James dies. He reigns truthfully from 1625 to 1649, second Stuart monarch to reign over the British. But yeah, he ends up causing the English Civil War, which the English Civil War, you study about it, was not really a type of conflict that was because of who was in power. It wasn't really anything to do with that. It was more really to do with how they were going to govern the country, because Parliament wanted a type of state where the monarchy was limited and they would have most of the power, to levy taxes and pass laws and things like that, versus King Charles and the Stuarts wanted more of divine right, absolutism. The king has all this power to do whatever he wants, and so that had a lot to do with why the English Civil War broke out. The English Civil War, by the way, was not one war. It was actually 3 wars, so-called English Civil Wars, they often call it, which I'll kind of get more into later. And his reign was kind of controversial. One of the things that made it real controversial was his wife. That was kind of a big problem. He married Henrietta Maria, who was the daughter of King Henry IV. Remember him? Good King Henry. They called him, of course, in France, the founder of the Bourbons. And she was Catholic. That was kind of an issue. And so a lot of people thought the Stuarts were kind of not really Catholic, but they were kind of supportive of the Catholics. And so a lot of people distrusted them on things like that. And so, yeah, later, the Stuarts are kind of related, they're cousins of the Bourbons because they kind of marry into their family and all that. And so that's kind of an issue. That's definitely in England also as well. Of course, one of the things that really started the English Civil War was in 1628. Parliament passes this thing called the Petition of Right, which came out, which was designed as a parliamentarian act to limit the powers of the English monarch, because the king was trying to do things that the parliament thought they shouldn't do. And one of the things he was trying to do, I know, was raise taxes without parliament's consent. And so they said basically that he couldn't do that. No tax without consent of parliament. Also, they said he could not imprison people without a trial, which he was actually doing. No quartering of soldiers, especially during peacetime, I think was what they wanted. No martial law in time of peace also as well. So these are things that he basically were hoping to limit his power overall. And at first he did that. He agreed to those terms in it. But what happened was he decided that he didn't want to do that anymore. And so he abolished Parliament in 1629, Charles I. And so this led to the so-called 11 years tyranny, or the personal rule of Charles I, where he reigned as an absolutist in the country. And I think that's the closest that the British really ever got to embracing absolutism, which in Europe they were doing. You see under Louis XIII, Louis XIV, like in France. And however, the only problem was Parliament controlled a lot of the purse strings and all that. And so over time, he's going to have to recall Parliament. And so this continues struggles with Parliament over time, which will eventually lead into a civil war breaking out. And what happened was in 1640, he recalled Parliament because there was apparently wars that were breaking out in Europe that the English got involved in. They had the Bishops' War in Scotland. Apparently, the Scots rebelled against England because Charles was trying to push episcopacy on them. He wanted them to have like bishops and priests like the Church of England had, that the Church of Scotland had these presbyters, or these elders that would run the church, and he wanted to push episcopacy on them and all that with having bishops and priests. And they didn't want to have anything to do with that. And so it created a big war over there. And then also in Europe, you had Maria Theresa's throne was challenged by Frederick the Great and others. So that caused that war to break out. And so England got involved in that also as well. So what happened was he summoned the Parliament at first in May. They wouldn't do what he wanted. And so he shut it down. That was the so-called short Parliament that only lasted about 3 weeks. And then they had another Parliament he put in afterwards in 1640, which was called the Long Parliament. It was called that because it was in power for a long time in England, for like 20 years, up through the English Civil War and afterwards. And what happened to cause the English Civil War to break out was that there was conflict with members of Parliament that were Puritans. Puritans were these Anglicans that were in the Catholic Church that wanted to purify the Church of England of Catholicism. They didn't like the fact that it wasn't Calvinistic enough. They wanted to be purely a Reformed type theology. And so he tried to have some of those members of Parliament arrested. And when he did that, that's what caused the whole Civil War to blow up, of course. So you get this English Civil War that breaks out in the country right here. So you have a deal where both sides form up in English Civil War, which the Civil War had different names. They often call it the War of the Three Kingdoms, sometimes in Britain. Some people call it the English or the British Civil Wars. So it wasn't really one war. It was actually 3 civil wars that would last almost a decade in England, Scotland, and Ireland and all that. You can see they had 2 different sides that were involved. You had one side, you had the so-called Cavaliers. The Cavaliers were those that supported King Charles I. And he had commanders under him like Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who I think was a nephew of his. And then he had his son, who also, I think, later also led troops, which was Charles, or Prince Charles, who was Charles II later as well. They were called royalists, but Cavalier was more of a nickname because they were kind of wealthy and supportive of basically Charles's reign and all that. And then on the right, you had the Roundheads. The Roundheads were a mixture of people. There were small landowners, town-dwelling manufacturers, and especially the Puritans. There was a lot of Puritans that backed the Roundhead side, which were the parliamentarian forces. And they were led by 2 men, Sir Thomas Fairfax, who was known as Black Tom. He was actually the commander of the actual forces of the parliamentarian side. And Oliver Cromwell, who was later a general, who was a member of Parliament, he became the one that really, in the end, would take over England afterwards. He kind of overshadowed Sir Thomas Fairfax and all that. And over time, they formed their own army, which was called the New Model Army. That was the parliamentarian army of the Long Parliament. And it was this English professional army they formed in 1645, which fought all over Britain, fought in England, fought in Ireland, they fought in Scotland during the English Civil Wars. And it was a modernized type of, army that used like muskets you see there that were kind of starting to come out, like the matchlock or wheel-lock muskets that kind of came out at the time. And the army even used like cannon also as well, things like that. And that's going to be very important later. The new model army, is going to be, decisive in defeating, King Charles and eventually taking over the country. Because what's going to happen later, Charles is going to eventually be arrested, put on trial. They'll execute him at one point at the end of the Civil Wars. And for a while, Oliver Cromwell will take over. He and his son Richard at one point take over the country and get rid of the monarchy for a while. But I'll get to it later next week. They'll restore the monarchy. They'll have the restoration of the Stuarts in 1660. Who will reign till like 1714. And I'll get to some of the other dynasties that come in later. You got the House of Hanover that'll take over. You get these German type dynasties that take over Britain as well. So next week, I'll talk more into like the rise of the British Empire, kind of in a part 2 lecture. As you know, this is kind of a short week because of, what happened with Mardi Gras. It doesn't look like there's any questions. Oh, of course, yeah, I know. Yes, the Bible was written by a man that was, well, I know he's homosexual, but he was bisexual, I guess was the correct term. That's kind of ironic about that. Yeah, about that. But he was really bisexual. I think he liked men and women. So that was kind of common, I think, those days, believe it or not, a long time ago. But anyway, before I go, reminder, don't forget, those are the main assignments I'll have out right now. Of course, first exam is out on the age of absolutism. That's like the main thing you'll need to kind of wrap up this week. There's that bonus quiz too that I've got out as well on the age of enlightenment and the scientific revolution. So wrap that up as well. You can also begin to upload your first exam study guides for extra credit, which I think worth 20 bonus points, I believe. That is all just on the age of absolutism topic. So you don't have to turn anything else in topic-wise in the study guide. So that's it for today. I'll send out later announcements, of course, about other things kind of going on with the class. But next week, like I said, I'll move on to talk about the rise of the British Empire, that second part. I think we'll also move in next week in week 8 to talk about, of course, the French Revolution. So we'll kind of move on into the 18th century and all that. So that's it for the week. Hope it's kind of a short week, but I hope y'all have a good weekend coming up that fast, end of the week. But I'll see y'all, of course, next week and all that. So y'all take care. Hope y'all had a great, of course, Mardi Gras and all that.